والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. MashaAllah. I hope you all are well rested and ready for this fantastic journey over the next 3 or 4 days, inshallah. We pray Allah blesses this gathering and makes it a means for transformation for us and allows us to fulfill our responsibilities and commitments with excellence and ihsan, inshallah. To begin proceedings this morning, it's my great honor and pleasure to call on Hafiz Hassan Shah to start this morning with the recitation of the glorious Quran, inshallah.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق خلق الإنسان من علق اقرأ وربك الأكرم الذي علم بالقلم علم الإنسان ما لم يعلم كلا إن الإنسان ليطغى أن رآه استغنى إن إلى ربك الرجعى أرأيت الذي ينهى عبدا إذا صلى أرأيت إن كان على الهدى أو أمر بالتقوى أرأيت إن كذب وتولى ألم يعلم بأن الله يرى كلا لئن لم ينته لنسفعا بالناصية ناصية كاذبة فليدع ناديه سندع الزبانية صدق الله العظيم.
MashaAllah, Jazakallah. Thank you very much, Hafiz Hassan Shah, for that beautiful and appropriate verses rendered with such beauty. Allah strengthen you, inshallah, and take you from strength to strength. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to open this conference and share an opening address with you this morning very quickly. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. All glory, praise and gratitude belong to Allah alone, the infinitely merciful, the creator, sustainer and the guardian of all that exists. He is Rabbul Alameen, nurturing every being with boundless compassion, and the sovereign of the day of reckoning, to whom our ultimate return is inevitable. We send our purest salam, heartfelt salutations and durood upon the most distinguished of all creation, the seal of all the prophets, an absolute pure model of eloquence, nobility, and unmatched virtue, a flawless example for all of mankind, and an enduring mercy to every soul across time and place, our beloved Nabi Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Imagine a gathering where the future of Islamic education is shaped, where school leaders, heads of Islamic studies, academics and researchers all come together to revive traditions and at the same time innovate for tomorrow. Welcome to the 2024 Global Association of Islamic Schools retreat in Malaysia. What a powerful and inspiring sight it is to witness the convergence of minds and hearts, all bound by a shared purpose, to revive and strengthen Islamic education. We are rooted in our tradition, yet propelled by the need to evolve to meet the demands of an ever-changing world. We are truly honored, ladies and gentlemen, to have such a distinguished lineup of speakers who are trailblazers in the field of Islamic education and provide thought leadership to us all. Their expertise and insights will guide us as we navigate the complex interplay between preserving our rich, time-honored traditions while at the same time addressing the dynamic educational needs of the global Islamic school movement. But this gathering is more than just another conference. It is a unique golden opportunity. How often do you find the opportunity to be in the presence of 250 delegates from over 28 countries, all committed to the same noble cause of nurturing the next generation of this ummah through Islamic education in Islamic schools? This, ladies and gentlemen, is our moment. This is our time to forge new friendships, establish meaningful networks, share best practices, and exchange ideas. It is our time to collaborate, to dream big, and to work together to advance our projects, to explore global opportunities and tackle shared challenges with fresh and global perspectives. We have created special slots on this program, one for dialoguing and two for networking. I pray, inshallah, you take full advantage of these opportunities to exchange ideas across our borders. It is said when the winds of change blow, some seek shelter while others build windmills. Today, we must ask ourselves, which will we be? We are not here just to listen, but to engage, to take significant steps forward, to ignite action, and to set the stage for real, tangible progress and transformation. The question is not simply what we will learn, but how we will implement that knowledge into living legacies, how we will implement these ideas in our schools, in our communities, and in the lives of the future generation we serve. My dear brothers and sisters, your insights, your experiences, and your voices are the heartbeat of this retreat. While our speakers will spark the conversation, it's our collective input that will drive the lasting, impactful change in our schools and in our own leadership of our institutions. Let me leave you with this thought. Knowledge without action is like a lamp without oil. It may have the potential to illuminate, but without fuel, it remains dim and unfulfilled. By gathering here today, we have already ignited a spark. Now it's up to us to keep feeding this flame with our commitment, collaboration, and dedication so that we may one day light the way to a revived and flourishing Islamic education system across the world. One that not only enlightens hearts, but transforms lives and communities. Let's make this retreat not just memorable, but also transformative. Please be sure to visit our exhibitors who have their stalls outside. Do take some time to have a look at the artwork presented by our young students. And please make sure you attend our gala dinner on Tuesday and forge stronger relationships with people across borders, inshallah. I encourage you to exchange seats and sit among different people during tea and lunch, exchange many business cards. It's an ideal opportunity to make new friends and forge new relationships. Try not to always be amongst your common friends, the people you've traveled with. It's an opportunity to meet people from other countries, and I trust you take full advantage of that. On Thursday, we will embark on a tour of leading Islamic schools in the Kuala Lumpur area, and we will also visit the International Islamic University of Malaysia, where you will witness firsthand the excellence and innovative practices here in Malaysia. It is my fervent prayer that every one of you will engage fully, share your insights, and build lasting connections that will strengthen our global network of Islamic schools. Let us move forward with a renewed sense of purpose and unwavering commitment to excellence in Islamic education globally, inshallah. I wish you all enjoy a beneficial, inspiring, and fruitful event. May Allah guide our efforts and bless our endeavors with success and sincerity, inshallah. Ladies and gentlemen, in your pack you received this morning, there's a luggage tag similar to the one that you have your name printed on, and there's also a bookmark. Both these items have someone else's name on them. It's not by accident, it's by design. Your challenge is, before the end of today, you got to find the owner and return it to them. Someone else has yours and will be seeking you out sometime today. So please make sure to have your name tag displayed, and also make an effort to find the people and return what is theirs, and allow them to return what is yours, inshallah. So this is the challenge for today. Hopefully it will encourage you to make friends and meet more people and return theirs to them. While I have the mic, I have the advantage and I can call up these two people. But I'm blessed that I know both these people whose tags are in my bag, and I'll seek them out and return it to them, inshallah. Also, at the end of every session throughout this retreat, a QR code will be displayed on the screen. Please make sure you have Wi-Fi on your phones. It's the Mardia Hotel, and you'll tune into the Wi-Fi. And we expect you to take no more than 3 minutes to complete a very simple feedback form. It's very important for us as organizers to get your feedback after every session. It won't take you more than 3 minutes. Please do take advantage of taking down that QR code and completing the survey form. 5 short questions, just click a choice and we're done, inshallah. Also on your tables, there's a little board that has acknowledgement of all of our sponsors. We'd like to acknowledge and thank them all. And also there on that, there's a little QR code which takes you to the digital brochure for this conference. You will find the full program, the outcomes for this conference. You'll find bio data of all of our speakers, abstracts of all of the speeches, articles from various presenters that have included in that brochure. Please do take the time to visit that brochure as well. Shortly today, we will be sharing with all the delegates a bio data document. When you registered for this conference, you received an email with a Google link asking you to provide some personal information that you'd like to share with other delegates, and also something about your own organization. So we've received a large number of responses, and we've compiled all of that into a little booklet, and that will come to you during the course of today. And so you can also meet digitally all the people that are in the room. In that questionnaire, we ask you what are your areas of expertise, and we also ask you what areas do you need assistance in. And so as you go through the biodata brochure, if you're a service provider, you'll see people that are seeking your service. And if you're looking for a service, you'll also see people who are offering that service, and inshallah, you can then connect. Email addresses are also on that brochure, so if you don't get to meet them here, when you get back home, you have all those email addresses, and I trust that you would again take advantage of one of the objectives of this retreat, which is to connect people globally and to make sure that you foster the networking and can advance and strengthen Islamic schools throughout the world, inshallah. So that's it from my side for the announcements for this event. It gives me great pleasure now to move on to the next item. And it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, one of the many keynote speakers we will have in this conference. Dr. Samir Mahmoud holds an MPhil and PhD in Islamic Studies from Cambridge in the UK. As the academic director of Usul Academy, which combines traditional Ottoman madrasa curriculum with contemporary social sciences, makes Dr. Samir an ideal candidate to address our theme, revival rooted in tradition. This is further enhanced by his deep experience in lecturing on Islamic psychology, further solidified by his many years of consulting on matters of Islamic education. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Dr. Samir Mahmoud to the podium to address the topic, nurturing the whole human being. Dr. Samir will speak for between 45 and 50 minutes. That leaves us with about 20 minutes for Q&A after the session. Mics have been set up on both sides of the hall. Please make note of your questions, and then you'll have an opportunity to engage with Dr. Samir at the end of his session for questions and answers, after which we'll break for tea, inshallah. Please help me welcome Dr. Samir Mahmoud.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين محمد بن عبد الله أفضل الصلاة والتسليم. Assalamu alaikum everyone. I'd like to first start by thanking the organizers for inviting myself here and all of you here so that we may share in our experiences and our expertise, inshallah, for the purpose of advancing Islamic education globally. Okay, Bismillah. So I have my own stopwatch here to make sure I don't go over time. The title of the talk is Nurturing the Whole Human Being. And what I want to explore today are a number of preliminary reflections that have to do with the way in which, in my own, with the organizations I work in my own context, how I've been trying to engage with a type of tajdeed mu'assal, as we call that at Rasul Academy, where I'm currently academic director. And also in the initiative I have, Cordoba Tutoring for high school students, the idea or the process of engaging with tradition by going back to the roots and principles as they were understood within the classical tradition, but at the same time also engaging with the best contemporary theory and practice. So what I'm sharing with you is an experiment that I've been involved in, and I decided to present the material today in a format in the same way in which I try to engage with teachers when I'm trying to unpack some of this material, inshallah. Okay, all right, so Bismillah. The first thing I want to just maybe draw your attention to in regards to the title is, I know it says tradition in the title, but we really have to unpack that and ask ourselves tradition or traditions. And by that I mean the Islamic tradition is a spectrum of perspectives. The wonderful beauty of Islam is it's a unity, not a uniformity, meaning that it is a broad spectrum of perspectives unified by an essence and a core, but one that admits of multiple possible perspectives and ways of looking at things. Whether you look at the four madahib or the different schools of aqidah or the different turuq, it's a spectrum. And Ahl Sunnah wa Jama'ah ultimately in Islam became the mainstream, but also it's a mainstream that is not settled on a single way of looking at things, but an acceptable spectrum of perspective. So that's very, very important, because if we are to confront the challenges of the world that we live in, we have to look at Islam in the sense of a tree. There are branches from a core stem with roots in the ground, and the analogy here to the Quranic symbol and image is obvious. But the reason why we need to draw on the broad spectrum is if we are to really enact the mandate of Islam as a final revelation, rahmah, a universality for all humanity, not just for Muslims, we really have to be able to confront the challenges that face humanity today. Islam was sent and designed and built into it is the capacity to address the issues and challenges facing humanity, not just Muslims. But if we are to do that, we can't really restrict ourselves to one particular perspective or tradition. Bima'na, I'm not talking about here talfiq or anything like that. What I am suggesting is we have to draw on the broad spectrum of different schools of thought, whether in fiqh or usul or aqidah, or even drawing on perspectives like the sound approaches to falsafa and tasawwuf and tazkiyah, in order to enrich ourselves with the resources we need to confront the unprecedented challenges facing the world today. You can't confront the challenge of postmodernism or the challenge of the environmental degradation of the planet by insisting that I belong to a single tradition or a single thought, a school of thought, and I'm going to stick by my guns and claim that I can confront all these challenges for the Ummah and the world, drawing only on that. I think we have to humble ourselves and accept the classical perspective of exploring the wide spectrum of possible. We also, as a note, we have to engage with perspectives and be able to operationalize these perspectives within a contemporary educational context. Now, that's very, very important. What do I mean by that? Well, the video is on that image, but this is an image that inspires some of my work. It's based on the psychology of Sayyidina Naqib al-Attas. This is a book about his psychology. It's a wonderful synthesis, a wonderful work that combines different perspectives, Ghazali and Avicenna and a bit of Akbari in one single model. It's a brilliant kind of way of engaging with the tradition in order to present something that's contemporary, or at least can confront contemporary issues and challenges. But any educator who looks at this asks themselves, how can I operationalize this? How can I use this as a framework for teachers in order to understand what's happening within the educational process? I think the big challenge is, well, the previous generation did an immense amount of work. I think our task is operationalizing, i.e. making it viable, intelligible to teachers. And not only that, when teachers look at the development of sensory motor skills in children, or emotional well-being, or all sorts of different indicators, they ask themselves, how can this help me understand what's happening within the psyche of the child? And I'm going to come back to this idea of the child a little bit later, because we often tend to think that children are just small adults. Children are very, very different creatures. And so in the field of education, we have to look at things a little bit differently when we talk about children. And a lot of the models we try to draw on in the classical Islamic tradition in order to illuminate childhood sometimes don't work. And I'll explain what that I mean in a minute. So I'm going to try to unpack some of this, not using the same jargon. As I said, I work in a school context all the time with teachers, so I try to unpack things in a language that's, to a certain extent, intelligible, or at least I think it's intelligible. A lot of the students and teachers complain this is still quite, the terminology is a bit difficult. The last point I want to make before I start the presentation officially is revival rooted in tradition does not exclude engaging with the best contemporary theory and practice, but it does presuppose that you have to root yourself first before you can confidently engage. A lot of people go into education, go into a secular training program, and then throw on the label Islamic because they're Muslims, or they practice Islam, or they're working in an Islamic context. That doesn't work. I think teacher training has to undergo a radical revolution. We need a 4-year BA in Islamic education that combines a classical Islamic ulum curriculum with a lot of what our classical tradition already has to say about education and educational theory, combined with best contemporary theory and practice, and a familiarity with the contemporary geography of education globally. So that's a monumental task, and I think that's the next stage we have to head towards. And at Usul Academy, our aspiration is to launch one such initiative, not a 4-year program, but starting with a 1-year program, inshallah. Okay, all right, so the human being, al-insan, some traditional perspectives. Now note, some traditional perspectives. My presentation is not exhaustive. There are many other possible perspectives that we can draw on, but I'm going to offer some reflections based on a few ideas. We are familiar with terms like insan in the Quran. We're familiar with the notion of ahsan al-taqweem, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creates the human being. We're familiar with ahsan al-khalqa, insan. We're familiar with notions like Khalifa, all Quranic terms. Insan Kamil, which is a non-Quranic term, but we're familiar with some of these terms. Insan Kamil is a term that often receives a lot of attention, sometimes positive, sometimes critical attention. But I want to translate and use the term here within the context of education as the whole human being, or the complete human being. Often it's translated as the perfect human being, and I think the connotations of the English language don't do it justice. Insan al-Kamil, or something that is Kamil, is also complete and whole. not necessarily something that's devoid of or doesn't have any deficit or any, it's not perfect in the sense of only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is perfect, of course. So I want to draw out the completeness and wholeness aspect of that term. These are hand-drawn, by the way, a lot of these images. I work in a Waldorf, I work in a Waldorf context and environment, and I really like the hand-drawn aspect of it. And I think that's very important for pedagogy, but that's another issue I don't want to get into. I tend to go into side tangents a lot, but I won't do that today, inshallah. So what is the human being? I'm going to propose approaching the answer to this question from two different perspectives. There is a static or snapshot view, right? So you take a human being and you x-ray the human being. What does a human being consist of? You see all the organs, the body, the head, etc., right? If we were to do an x-ray of the metaphysical aspect of the human being, right? What does the human being consist of? Aql, qalb, ruh, nafs, etc., right? So I'm going to present that perspective and then try to unpack it a little bit. And then I'm going to present another perspective, which is, how does the human being develop? Very, very crucial question that is often ignored in contemporary Islamic educational theory. We take a static model and say, this is the model we're going to use on the child. But we often don't realize that the child doesn't have any of those elements yet. They're in flux still. So I'm going to offer a dynamic or developmental view, atwar wa marahil. We're talking about atwar, we're talking about marahil of the growth of the human being. A human being is in a process of becoming, never static. And then I'm going to offer a few reflections on the nature of the child. What are the unique characteristics of childhood? In any theory of contemporary Islamic education, what is our unique understanding of the human being, how the human being develops, and then how we get the child through various stages to that end goal. A lot of us rely on secular theories, developmental psychology, all sorts of Montessori theories, etc. We do have enough resources to build a very mature, very sophisticated, contemporary framework that makes sense to contemporary teachers by relying and rooting ourselves in classical sources. And in the room today here, mashallah, sitting right next to me on that table, Sheikh Ahmed Al-Azhari is a gem and a resource on these classical texts and sources that the various texts he's edited. So we need to really pull together our resources. Professor Zafar Ahmed mentioned, importantly, we're here to collaborate. No single person can do this work. We need to collaborate and pull together the resources to do this. And then throughout the presentation, I'll draw out some implications for education. Okay, so I might have to move at a faster pace. I've already got 32 minutes left. So bismillah. Okay, so what do we mean by a static or snapshot view? I'm going to look at this human being from various perspectives. You can look at a human being from the front, from the side, from the back. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to say, this is one perspective we can look at the human being. This is another perspective. The important thing to bear in mind when I share these perspectives is they're not mutually exclusive. As Dr. Nadeem once pointed out to me, each perspective is expressing an intent. Yani, it's answering a question. People often say, is the human being this or is the human being that? I'll share a few perspectives. It's not either or, it's both and. Right? We're very complex creatures, and there are various possible perspectives we can take on the human being, depending on the intent and the question we're trying to answer. So let me start. Okay, so what is the threefold view of the human being? If I were to ask a simple question, what is the human being? We can say that the human being is a ruh. That's not incorrect, right? We're essentially a spirit from God, no? That yellow kind of circle up there. And that's one way. We can call this the one-fold view, right? But that doesn't really complete the picture, because as embodied creatures, we are also, another way of looking at the human being is to say we're conjoined to a body. We're spirit and matter. Okay, things get a little bit more complicated. Spirit and matter combined, what do they produce? A third mixture, let's say, or something in between. Don't take the circles too literally. We're not three different things. We're an integrated unity. We're an integrated unity. The human being is an integrated unity, but there are different aspects to us. Right? When spirit, ruh, merges with body, what emerges out of that, at least from one perspective in the classical tradition, is nafs. So nafs, what is nafs? What is the soul? The soul is really an entity that has traces of its origin, which is the ruh. But it's that aspect of the ruh that is mingled with a body, right? Now the picture gets very complicated because now we have a body, we talk about a soul, we talk about a spirit, right? So, okay, all right. I'll talk about some of the faculties a little bit later, but essentially, and again, I'm emphasizing this is one way of looking at the human being. There are many, many different ways, and we have to embrace these multiple perspectives. Okay. So let's unpack that a little bit. So this is where, with teachers, they tell me, okay, body, what does that mean? So in the classical Islamic tradition, we have this idea that the reality, existence, is multiple in the sense of there's maratib al-wujud. There are multiple levels of being. Most of us sitting here in this room, our bodies exist on the material plane, alam al-mulk, physical world in a sense. Right? But our minds, our feelings on the inside, our psychic life does not exist on the material plane. Right? It exists on another plane. Our ruh exists on yet another plane. So there are multiple levels of being. Multiple levels of being. Within the human being, we embody that. Our body exists in the physical world, right? Our nafs, our feelings, our mind, our thoughts, our ideas exist in that intermediary world called alam al-malakut, let's say. There's a lot more nuanced understanding of that, but let's just go with that. Our ruh, even higher, exists in yet higher dimension. Right? And then ultimately, above all that is alam al-lahut, which is the divine realm, which is beyond time and space and beyond any realm of manifestation. Right? This is a classical Islamic metaphysical way of looking at reality. Now, why this is important is because every level of reality, there corresponds different kinds and forms of knowledge, maratib al-ulum. So not all knowledge is the same, and not all knowledge explores the same level of reality. Right? Which means there are different disciplines for exploring different levels of reality. The most obvious one is to say biology explores the body, psychology explores the psychic world, ilahiyat or theology or kalam explores the relationship between the divine and the created world. Right? Can you see these three disciplines explore three different levels of reality to a large extent? So when we talk about the body, now we have a body and we have we can unpack that and say the body is the outward expression of spirit. The body gives the spirit access to the physical world through the five senses. The body is this material substratum created by God to receive the ruh, which acts as a mudabbir of this body. Right? So already here we have a very complex unpacking. But the last one I want to emphasize a little bit. The spirit and body gradually become more distinct in our field of experience at adulthood. Right? If we ask ourselves the question, imagine the ruh, this remarkable entity from the unseen world, and you have a zygote that's emerging and developing into a fetus. Does it have a ruh? Well, at some point it does. Right? But we often don't understand or don't often think about the fact that the ruh is in constant relationship to an emerging material vehicle called the body, into which it takes residence. Right? And through pregnancy, birth of the child, all the way up to the age of 21, the ruh is still accommodating itself, guiding the process of the development of the body, and taking up residence. A very young child still doesn't have a distinct sense of I or ego. Right? So spirit and body are interacting in a way in which the spirit, ruh, guides the developmental process of the child. But the child requires years and years and years until all their qiwa, all their faculties, all aspects of the totality of their human being become fully realized and actualized. Right? Many say it happens at the age of rushd, which is usually late teens or 21. Right? But throughout this whole process, what's happening? A seed is growing into a small plant, growing into a tree. And you are the stewards of this process. Right? So that's important to always keep in mind because we tend to kind of ignore or not always pay attention enough to what are the components of the human being at various levels of their existence, and when are these different aspects developing? I'm not going to read every single one of these. You can read it. It's up there. Can you shift the video to the other side, if possible? But as you can see, every level of our existence has assigned to it different aspects of our being. Right? At the highest level, we can say that the ruh is the asl. It's the center of our distinct sense of self, our distinct sense of identity, and our distinct connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So even though we do have, you might say, okay, a child doesn't have yet a fully developed ego, but they have a connection through their ruh to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the differentiation between these two happens over a process. And you're guiding the process, right? You're guiding the process. The soul really acted as an intermediary. And the soul is somewhere in between. It's a realm of feelings. It's a realm of thoughts. It's a realm of ideas. It's a realm in which the body, through the instincts and drives, interacts with our higher aspect. Yeah? And I'll unpack that in the next slide, inshallah. But important, based on this model, important principles to keep in mind is the first. The human being consists of these three aspects. Each has a distinct nature, characteristics, and effect. Each level has a form of knowledge. So the body of knowledge we need to educate the body is different from the knowledge we kind of need to educate the soul and to educate the spirit. The question to educate is what bodies of knowledge do we have in the curriculum that educated these three parts of the human being? And within the soul, as we'll see later, there are even more faculties, right? So what are we doing? What usul, what maratib, what methodologies are we using for each one of these forms of knowledge, for one of these levels of being within the human being? Each level has an athar, an effect on the other, right? The body affects the soul affects the body. That's important. Unless you nurture nutrition and health of the child, there's a problem. There can be problems in their own internal development, right? So physical health is not secondary, but that's absolutely essential and important. The higher level always includes the lower. If I were to ask you a question here, raise your hand. Does your body have a soul? Raise your hand if you agree with that statement. Okay, sorry, maybe it's a trick question. But anyway, all right. It does have a soul, but it's actually the soul that has a body, not the other way around. Bima'na, the body. So if you look at me standing up on the stage, I apologize if you have to stare at me. Not the most pleasant thing to look at, but we often tend to think that our soul is somehow in this body, confined by this skin. That's a misunderstanding. Right? The soul has a body, not the body has a soul. Right? The soul is vaster than the confines of the physical body. And the ruh is even vaster than that. Which means when you walk around in physical space, it doesn't mean your soul is confined to the physical spaces that you walk around in. And the obvious example of that is when you have a dream, or if you have certain kind of experiences, you are literally feel like you're occupying a space beyond the boundaries of the body itself. I'm not going to get into that in too much detail, but it does revolutionize and turn everything upside down, because we tend to have a very, very kind of secular understanding. The body, first and foremost, physical, and that body has a soul within it somewhere. Let me search for the soul. No, it's the other way around. The ruh has so that the soul has a body. And that means that, that changes everything. Okay, so the lower can only be fully understood from the higher. Very important. You can't fully understand the body from the body's perspective. Biology can never give you a full insight into the nature of biological life. Now, that's very important, because a unified field theory of physics from the physics perspective won't work. The lower can only be fully contained by the higher. Let me give you an example. You're standing at the foothill of a mountain, and the grass is this high, you can't really see much. You go up a step, and you can see the savannah, a lot clearer. Right? The higher gives you a purview or perspective on the lower, which means any full understanding of the body has to come through a study of the body and also of every other higher level. And unless we do that, we can never have a full or holistic. So all these theories, all these fashionable theories around today in contemporary education about holistic approach to education that doesn't take into account the soul and the spirit can never deliver on its promise. It has a very narrow understanding of what holistic is, but it can never really encompass the totality of the human being, at least as we understand it in the classical Islamic tradition. Okay, all right, right. If we were to ask a different question, not what is the human being, what are the faculties of the human being? What are the a perception of knowledge? This is not exhaustive treatment, but I'm going to try to unpack the same diagram. Well, we have, at the physical level, we have the 5 senses. That's an obvious one. Some would claim there are more than 5 senses, but we won't get into that controversy. At the level of the soul, what are the faculties? Again, not exhaustive. I chose a few and kind of give them a new translation from Anikab al-Attas. We can say that the soul is the realm in which a certain aspect of our aql functions, our memory and recollection, the realm of feelings, and the realm of our lower imagination, at least where the soul touches and engages with the body. And we can say that the ruh, which is the seat of that ruh, is the heart, is the place of our higher faculty that connects us to God, the higher intellect, if you want. Some people add that, some people remove it. Our spiritual intuition of shuhud, our higher imagination, right? So every one of these aspects of us, within every aspect of us, reside different faculties or different modes or different doorways. Let's call it that. Doorways into different worlds, right? Doorways into different worlds. And this is important because when we come to the next slide and ask ourselves the question, what are the educational implications of this? And to what extent are we educating any aspect of these? It becomes a little bit tricky. To what extent do we train the imagination? Khayal. To what extent are we truly training aql? At least in the sense that we understand that in Islam. The lower sense of aql is widely known today in modern society. But the higher intellect that our tradition speaks of at length as that faculty within us, that sacred faculty within us, that has been given the task of understanding and knowing God and His signs in creation, to what extent do we actually train that? Our curriculum, our traditional curriculum has a whole pedagogy and curriculum on the training of the aql. How do we think? How to think? We often think we're born with cognitive capacities, therefore we assume we can think. Like everything in life, we have the bare minimum, but we haven't exhausted the full spectrum of the aql and its full capacities. By 21, we go to university. At university, at school, they claim that teach us how to think. Critical thinking is not how to think necessarily, right? So we have a whole curriculum on thinking and the relationship between thinking and aql and qalb. To what extent do we educate the heart? I'm not talking about sentiments and wishy-washy feelings, tree-hugging, hippie stuff. Right? I'm talking about qalb as the faculty of understanding or full understanding, and that faculty through which we understand God. Where in the curriculum can anyone tell me that we train the heart? That's an interesting question, right? Let alone, I think we do a good job to a certain extent by training memory, to a certain extent, I would say, not fully. But most schools today are adopting the whole emotional well-being thing, and they're trying to fill gaps in that area, but a lot is absent. Okay, I'll give you now another perspective. You might say, how many perspectives are there? There's twofold view of the human being, there's a threefold view, there's a fourfold view, there's a fivefold view, sixfold view, sevenfold view. Right? There's many. Right? There's nafs al-amara, nafs al-lawama, nafs al-mulhama, mutma'inna, aradiya, al-mardiya, al-kamila. That's one perspective. Okay, what intent and question is that model asking and answering? It's not mutually exclusive with this, but it's addressing a very different aspect of the human being, usually tazkiyah and practical ethics. Right? So if I were to ask a question, and I find this model that I'm looking at right now, which is derived from the Attasian one that I talked about, which is derived from Avicenna and Ghazali to a certain extent, that model, this model here, which a lot of Muslims refrain from trying to use in schools for some reason, is the most useful in understanding or answering the following question. what is actually happening in the natural capacities of a child as they go from 0 to 21. I'm not talking about nafs al-ammara, nafs al-lawama. A child of the age of 2 doesn't have a nafs al-ammara. Doesn't exist. They have instincts and drives, but they don't have the nafs al-ammara bis-su' yet. They're not moral agents yet. Right? Their instinct and drives are pure instinct and drives in their raw purity, the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created it. So I can't apply that model to children, right? Very important. I can apply it to 14, 15, 16-year-olds, right? Because at the age of 14, something happens. The upsurge of testosterone, hormones, etc., the development of certain feeling functions within the child, sexual drive, etc., and the kind of the tension between moral development, the capacity to discern, which starts at 7 but kind of matures at 14, the capacity to cognitively think, which starts at 14 and matures at 21. Yeah, you have to really look at what's developing when and how in order to understand. So I'm going to use this model. Can you move the image to the other side again? I do apologize, but I'm quite proud of the hand drawing. I had an artist help me with this, by the way. I'm not that good. So what is the human being? We can say, well, the human being incorporates within their own being all the kingdoms of nature. All the kingdoms of nature. At the most basic physical level, you have what you might call nafs ma'daniyya, mineral soul, meaning that your body shares with the mineral world the same constituent elements. Now, that's an obvious one. We know it from biology or physics, etc. Right? But the human being also incorporates within their being another kingdom of nature. If you look around in nature, what do you see? You see pebbles, rocks, stones. That's one level of reality, right? And in classical Islamic ontology, each one of these is a different level. The mineral kingdom is the lowest, and then you see in the natural world, what do you see? You see also plants. So let's have a look at the properties of mineral world, right? They have certain kind of properties. If you break a rock into 2, you've got 2 rocks, right? So the principle of unity of the rock is contained in every part. When you go into the vegetative kingdom, right? What are the characteristics of plants? They grow, nutrition, right? But to a certain extent, yes, plants, when you break off a part, it can grow again, to a certain extent, right? And the vegetative soul within us has the same properties as the vegetative kingdom, which is nutrition and growth in the body. We also notice in the world around us animals. Right? Animals are beings that are kind of higher than plants. I mean, plants can't move unless they're Ents from Lord of the Rings. They can't pick up and walk, right? Trees usually stand still, but they move upwards. They have a certain kind of movement. Rocks are inert. They can't be moved unless they're moved. Plants have an upward movement. Animals can self-move. They can move themselves around. So there's something different about animals. There seems to be a ruh mudabbira, or some soul thing, entity that's kind of moving it around, right? So in animals, we find that movement results from inner forces of movement, hunger, thirst, sexual drive, etc. Developed nervous system, they have an inner world of basic feelings and drives, instincts, impulses. Right? Plants don't have sexual instincts necessarily, or at least not in the sense that animals do. Right? But above the animal kingdom, if you look around, there is another creature who walks the earth who seems to have all these within their being, but something else, right? And that is the human being. Is there any other type of creature on earth? These are the 4 kingdoms, right? The human being has a heart through which they recognize God, a rational thinking, nafs akhira, nafs natika, etc., a unique sense of identity, an I. That's very unique to human beings. Right? Irada, a will, and a conscience. Right? And a conscience. Now, that's not a translation of the word conscious, but I wanted to use this word here to convey the sense that we possess an inner capacity to distinguish between good and evil. But my question is, with this model of understanding the human being, or this perspective, what implication does it have for education? Can it help us better understand children? We're getting a little bit closer. We're edging a little bit closer. Now I understand, okay, these are all the perspectives on the child. Well, the human being has all these, but the child doesn't have all these yet, right? They're developing, right? And so how do we train the will in the child? I haven't seen a single aspect of any curriculum that changes the human will, that trains the human will, right? Or the heart. Conscience, of course, we do a lot with ethics and shakhsiyya development and character development, etc., and virtues. But this model I find very useful in helping us understand what is the human being, right? But it's not enough, because that doesn't tell me anything about the child yet, right? So in the next few slides, I want to move on a little bit towards unpacking this in regards to the child. But some implications these may have, and I've written down a few of them. I can't go over in detail, we're running out of time. But some implications of these may be that every aspect or every level of the, every kind of level of soul, if you will, or every level of our being has certain requirements that need to be educated or developed, right? So at the mineral basic level, sensory motor skills, kinesthetic, nutritional, physical balance, health. At the level of the vegetative and animal soul, we have to focus really on balance, rhythm. We have to look at cultivating the virtues. You might say, why the virtues? Well, in children, at a certain age, certain capacities, cognitive capacities, moral capacities, feeling capacities, physical, sexual capacities are developing, right? And so there had to be adequate tahdhib of the akhlaq at that age in order to keep the nafs al-hayawaniyya or shahwaniyya at bay and under the rulership of the emerging aql that hasn't yet fully emerged in a child yet. Right? A child doesn't have a full aql yet. At age of 14, their cognitive capacities begin to fully develop, but they're not there yet. Right? So educating the will, etc. Okay, all right. So what is the dynamic perspective then? Let's have a look at, again, some of these. The basic processes of development, we can say that there are many more, but I've just summarized. You can say there's a vertical metaphysical process that begins with the soul in alam al-malakut or alam al-ruh and acts downwards on the mind and the body. And then there's a horizontal process in alam al-mulk, the physical world, that begins in the physical body and acts upwards and horizontally through time. It acts on the mind and the soul, right? So we have two dimensions we have to look at really when we talk about dynamic development of the child. The intertwining of both trajectories propel the process of formation and transformation from potentiality to actuality, right? We have to look, now most educational theory doesn't even look at the vertical dimension at all. And at the horizontal dimension, it's usually quite flat, one-sided, and one-dimensional. We can speak of, if we talk about the vertical processes, we can talk about, and now I'm trying to unpack things, a view of education that sees the human being as beginning with God and ending with God is a very different perspective that sees the human being as beginning at birth and ending at death. Because your journey from birth to death is part of one arc of a larger circle. And that has huge revolutionary implications in education, right? That would be a ta'deeb and ta'aleem that understands that we begin with God in the arc of mabda, descent, and we return to God is a very different perspective, right? There's a downward movement into this world, and it begins with what one might call, I'm calling here, so the tradition doesn't call it this, but to make it palatable to teachers, I talk about that before we came into this world, we were embraced in the divine rahmah. I call it rahmah, heavenly womb, a heavenly womb. Right? And then we come into the motherly room in the female body, right? And according to the Hadith al-Qudsi, the Rahim was given its name from the divine name Ar-Rahman, right? So there's a link between the womb, the earth, the compassionate womb of the mother that unconditionally nurtures the life of the child, with the cosmic womb within which we were all contained before we even came into the world, right? And we can speak of a third womb. When a child is born, in the first 2 years, they exist as a unity with the mother and the mother's unconditional care and love, with a non-differentiated sense of identity or ego yet, right? And notice how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, through His rahmah, He sends us from one womb to the next and to the next until we're ready for the world. The heavenly womb of divine rahmah into its equivalent on earth, which is the womb of the mother, into the warm embrace of the mother as the child is born, And then things begin to happen after that. Right? So we have a very different view of the human journey into this world. Then there's the inbreathing, the nafkh of the ruh, the Quran speaks about, and then which brings into our existence a fitrah. Now, a theory of education based on the fitrah very different from a secular theory of education. Let me unpack that a little bit. Right? We have a fitraic endowment when we don't come into this world as a tabula rasa, in the sense of a clean slate upon which society constructs and imprints its own images and influences. We come into this world, I'm not suggesting we come to this world with knowledge necessarily, but we come in with dispositions and innate tendencies towards, right? And this is what the fitrah is. Recognizing our divine creator, the one, recognizing the good, and I would add in some traditions, recognizing an innate capacity to recognize the beautiful, right? Beauty. But the fitrah is often associated in some traditions with the day of Alast in the Quran, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes us stand before him and testify that he is our Lord. So before we came into this world, you stood before your Lord. You had a witnessing experience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in which you testified. Each and every one of us testified individually to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the memory of that event comes into this world with us. Sayyid Abdul Rahman calls it az-zakira al-asliyah. Or we have a spiritual memory and we have a psychological memory. Psychological memory is of our childhood. A spiritual memory is of our spiritual existence before we came into this world. So you come into this world with a lot already, imprints of the totality of the divine names upon your soul. You're imprinted, matbu'an biha, right? The names. And so we come into this world with a set of dispositions, an endowment of dispositions, innate patterns of order and meaning that seek realization, and which emerge at various stages of our childhood. We don't come into this world and everything has to be realized day one. At every stage of our childhood, different aspects of the fitrah seek realization. And unless there are conditions, social, communion, family conditions and relations that are in place, right, to assist these different dispositions that seek realization to manifest, we have developmental problems, right, and pathologies that emerge. Okay, all right. We have 3 minutes left. Okay, all right. And so if we look at this arc again, we can see that we come down from God, the conception, the womb. If we look at the birth to death, let's have a closer look at conception. We can see there's a wonderful journey here in the womb. But what I want to focus on here is, in our tradition, the ruh guides the process of the development of the fetus. Right? There's a very important vertical element that is often missing. And one of our brothers here from Turkey who talk about 5D or often emphasize this importance of always taking into account the divine element or causality as a primary cause in every process in this world. But if we move on to talk about, for example, this journey from birth to death, our tradition talks about mawasim al-umr. There are many texts on this. Mawasim, the seasons of life. We have different seasons in our life. Childhood is very different from teens, they're different from the 20s, etc. Not only that, every single phase of our lives has subcategories and subphases. And they talk about this at length. And nowhere do I ever see any of this deployed in any of our educational frameworks and teaching. Right? We always rely on what the schools or secular framework offers us, but we have our own indigenous understanding of the different stages of life and the unique characteristics of each and the central role of akhlaq and futuwa in the formation of this process. So, tarbiyah, ta'aleem, ta'deeb, tazkiyah, tahqiq. Each one means something different. Sometimes we use them synonymously. Each one is a separate curriculum. Each one acts and enacts something very different on the body, on the soul, and on the spirit. Again, we can't get into details of all these, but let's have a closer look at, in the next minute or so, childhood, for example, 0 to 21. Let's zoom in on that. We can talk at length about the adulthood and decline, but let's talk about childhood, for example. Our tradition teaches us and tells us that we have various stages, atwar wa marahil. Some of them, and there are differences of opinion and different perspectives on this, but I've kind of latched onto a specific phase, which is typology, 0 to 7, birth to discernment or tamyiz. At the age of 7, we call it the age of tamyiz. Why? We now know from developmental psychology that children develop a certain capacity to discern and distinguish because of the emerging cognitive capacities that are happening at that specific age. But we have to even go even further than that, divide from 0 to 2, from 2 to 5, from 5 to 7, they're very different. Our tradition teaches us, and one hadith that a dear friend of mine, Dr. Yusuf Jah, I discussed with, and we kind of confirmed with a few scholars, that there's a famous hadith that I can't recall right now, but at the age when the child learns to speak, they begin to lose the fitrah. We know from developmental psychology that the moment the child begins to speak is the moment that the ego development is happening. Right? And when a child begins to speak and understand their parents are what? Indoctrinating them, right? So 2 is the age in which there's a differentiation now beginning to happen, an emerging ego identity. And it's a very dangerous period because either we continue educating the child in the fitrah, or they can begin to veer off the fitrah as early as 2. As early as they're able to speak, they begin to distinguish between themselves and others quite clearly, and they develop all sorts of internal capacities, and of course object relation theories and attachment theories and all sorts of these theories talk about these, right? And this is what I said earlier, we have to really engage with these various theories on our own terms because many of them are speaking very important insights that are valid. Some of them come from frameworks that are problematic, right? But from 0 to 7, what are the characteristics of the child? In other traditions, we are told that the child is playful. You play with your child from this age to this age. So play becomes not just a pedagogy, it becomes a way in which the child actually internalizes and engages with the world, right? From 7 to 14, again, there were different stages within the 7 to 14, but discernment to puberty or bulugh. Right? Why does a child in Islamic fiqh at the age of 14 roughly become morally obligated in fiqh? At that age, they're beginning to develop a unique cognitive capacity to think critically and clearly. They develop the capacity to start logical thinking, causal thinking at the age of 11, 12. By 14, it's roughly matured. But without the capacity to discern and to cognitively think clearly in a logical way about consequences of actions, and without a prior development of moral capacity, which also begins to come into its own at 14, how can the child be morally obligated? So we already have in our tradition a lot of implicit thinking about what's happening at various ages. SubhanAllah, at the age of 14, precisely when the child's hormones are kicking in, their critical thinking function is coming in at the same time. Can you imagine a child at 14 with no critical thinking capacity whatsoever? It's a nightmare, right? SubhanAllah. So by design, certain things are kicking in at the same time to balance other things that are developing in the child. And so what do we educate the child on at this age? Again, this has implications for the curriculum. I work a lot with teachers in early teens, and we try to induct them into hero stories about the awliya, about heroes who slay the dragon. Why? Because it teaches the child that if they take moral responsibility into their actions, into their own lives, for their decisions, through the training of the will, they can overcome whatever changes that are happening within them. The hero slays the dragon, the awliya overcome their nafs, right? So at every stage, we have to teach adequate stories that are appropriate for the particular developmental capacities that are emerging within the child at that age. I have a whole course that I teach to parents, to educators, going specifically into every age and what to teach and how we teach it and whatnot. But this presentation is meant just to show, give you a glimpse into how complex our tradition actually is, how rich it is, and how we can engage it on its own terms, but at the same time unpack it in a way that engages with contemporary theories, but on its own terms, and develops it in a language that is intelligible to teachers, right? Intelligible, they're very important. Okay, so I'm going to go very quickly through the rest. So we end up with models on the outer development of the child, the inner development of the child, the various stages they go through, etc. And then we end up with a very elaborate understanding. We can then map physical developments, emotional developments, ego developments, moral developments, religious developments, and all sorts of other developments based on operationalizing the classical perspective I saw earlier. I tried to articulate earlier. I hope I tried to I mean, for those of you not familiar with the Attasian model, you probably didn't see the connection. But I tried to take that, simplify it a little bit, and try to unpack it to make it useful for teachers. Because a lot of teachers often tell me, all these Islamic stuff is really interesting, but how can I use it in my classroom? How can I use it in my observation of children? What ends up happening is they fall back on their default mode of using the secular models they relied on for such a long time. What we need to do is develop our own indigenous educational philosophy and framework, right? Through this collaborative effort, and it's possible. And what I've done isn't that yet. What I'm trying to show you is an example of engaging with something. And I hope I'm waiting for very critical feedback on this, but engaging with something on its own terms, but at the same time engaging with what's happening today in the contemporary educational context. So if we were to summarize, we can say that an Islamic educational framework for the development of the whole human being has to draw on a wide spectrum of traditional Islamic perspectives. It has to address and cultivate all aspects, all dimensions, all levels of our being. It has to nurture all faculties, powers, capacities of perception, knowledge, and being. It has to include all stages of child and human development, each in its own terms and each according to its own nature. The child is not a miniature adult. So we have to stop imposing adult models of psychology on the child. We have to understand what is happening at the child at this particular moment, cognitively, morally, emotionally, in terms of their ego development, in terms of their nafs, in terms of this, in terms of that, right? So it's a very different set of questions we have to ask. And we also have to engage with best theory practices that align with the Islamic worldview. I try to implement as much of this as possible within my own work with high school students, and this is something that also emerged out of my work with Usul Academy at the university level. I found working at the university level is a lot easier. The biggest challenge I had in life is when I left academia and started working in early childhood and schools. And I admire every single teacher in this room and principal, because it has been the most challenging work I've ever encountered in my life. It's very easy to sit in an ivory tower in Cambridge and pontificate about the nature of reality. But when I had my own children, I tried to understand what these creatures were. And I'm still mind-boggled. I'm still confused, right? But, and then I realized the biggest problems in our ummah is that when we receive them at the university, it's already too late. We have to transform education and early childhood in order to reform and advance the ummah, not just for ourselves. Again, we have a universal mandate for all of humanity. And I often speak, sometimes I try to avoid using Islamic. I try to use fitraiq. Right? It opens up bridges and builds kind of connections with other human beings. Wallahu a'lam. Wa barakallahu feekum. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I think it's Q&A time. Is that correct? Yes, okay, inshallah.
Jazakallah, thank you very much, Dr. Samir, for that very insightful presentation. They say you have to be agile. You've got to learn, unlearn, and relearn. And I think you've given us opportunities to do some of that. I always thought that the soul is in the body. I have to unlearn and relearn that it's the other way around. Thank you very much for that. Ladies and gentlemen, the PowerPoint slides for all of the presentations through this conference will be shared on our Shah Alam group. So you don't have to worry about taking copious notes of the slides. Those will be shared. Your notes would be all of the extra things that the presenters will be sharing with you, inshallah. So we have about 10 to 15 minutes for any questions you might have for Dr. Samir. We have a mic here for the sisters, and we have a mic on that end for the brothers. If you could please come up to the mic and pose your questions. Please, we have a limited time, so we don't want any repeat speeches. We'd like you to keep your questions succinct and direct to Dr. Samir, and we'll take. So if you could just line up, ladies on this side, men on that side. I'll take Sufia first, and then we'll go to...
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Samir. Thank you so much for that presentation. One of the things you mentioned was about children, at what age they've developed, so much so where they, I think you said, when they recognize the difference between self and others. And you mentioned just recently in your closing about the need to impress upon them or to teach them and to get that spiritual development in at a very young age. How young would that be? And wouldn't that involve, if it's actually pre-early childhood education, then, or early learning as we call it, I know in the US, that would mean a lot of parent engagement. And have you thought about ways to do that so that we can take all of this back with us?
Okay.
Sorry, it's a lot.
It's more of
It's
a
whole
kind
other
of
session.
a question out. Yeah. So look, essentially, look, if when you ask the question, what do we mean by spiritual development in a child? I mean, what's going on in the child? There's no clear I. There's no clear self. I meant education here in the broader sense. If you take a child for a walk, that's education. Right? If you're performing adab around the child, that's education. Right? Because specifically at this age, they're absorbing, right? So so in some of the material I have these distinctions based on a tradition that it's not prophetic tradition, but it's there in Imam Ali radiallahu anhu said it, and it's there in various educational texts, which is that you play with a child for 7, and Sidi, maybe Ahmed Al-Azhari can correct me on the actual source on this, but you play with them for 7. You become, what's the second one? Anyway, or another tradition, they're your master at a young age, then you're their master, and then they become their wazir or their friend in teens. And if you unpack that, it's really interesting, because if you ever try to be a master of a child, it's impossible. Right? They're your master, meaning that you're always accommodating yourself and adapting yourself to the children. And so at that particular age, we ask ourselves, what is their learning mode? And their learning mode is pure imitation, taqleed, right? And so taqleed, what does that mean? It means that they're imitating everything you're doing, right? They're absorbing everything you're doing. And so what you want them to be, you have to be yourself. What you want them to be, you have to be yourself. And so that's what I meant by, but then the child is not yet conscious yet. So we can't sit them and educate them in the sense of you would an adult, right? But a lot of their bodily engagements are purely spiritual. You might say, hang on, how is that the case? A young childhood, their ruh is infused with their bios a lot more intensely than it is for adults, where they're separated. And so the playful way in which the child engages with the natural world around them may seem like it's a bodily engagement, but it's actually pure spiritual engagement. If you understand what the spirit is and what it's doing at different ages, it kind of changes the way we see what the child is doing, and therefore how we educate them. But basically, at that age, at the very early age, they're absorbing everything around them. Right? So what you're doing. At a next stage, they're not imitating anymore, they're emulating. What does that mean? It's ittiba, it's not taqleed. What's ittiba? It means the child had developed to a stage where they want and search for an authority they respect to follow. Right? Emulation and imitation are very different things from 7 onwards. Meaning they're searching for someone they can emulate, but out of respect for the authority of the person who seems to embody what they say they're doing, what they're preaching. And then at 14, there's more of a quasi stage of self-autonomy to a certain extent. That's why you become their friend at that age. So, I mean, we don't have time to unpack that all. Maybe in the corridor we can unpack it, and then what kind of stories are appropriate, and how to cultivate imagination and all that kind of stuff. Inshallah. Okay. One more question over there. Yep.
Assalamu alaikum. It's not really a question, but just 2 comments. I got a bit disturbed on a personal level when he said above 70 is decline. I'm 72 years old. Now I can understand when my wife tells me when I stretch my imagination, I pull a muscle, But the point really, I'm so humble by this presentation. I think it's an appropriate place to start. And amongst many things, I do parenting programs. And I think as teachers, there's so much we need to do, inshallah, if you want to connect with our loved ones to ensure they are empowered and they do beautiful things. So I really, truly appreciate your presentation.
Barakallahu feekum. And just a quick note on that, that's how the tradition calls it. I would probably come up with something different, maybe.
No, in fact, I tell people, you never retire, but you refire, you know.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Jazakallah for the lovely presentation. My question is that you have told us that this is one kind of thinking or one kind of framework. Is there any, on this, what you have shown us, do you have any framework which converts into a curriculum, which converts into a syllabus, and how does it work actually practically?
That's currently happening, inshallah. Currently happening. At Usul Academy, we've developed an educational framework, alhamdulillah, and we're getting to the second stage, which is trying to look at what that looks like for a broad mapping of a curriculum. But it's still in its early stages. But it's a work in progress, inshallah. But the initial philosophy, so a lot more than what I just presented, is we have a 120-page document that's quite elaborate. And it looks at different... and what I like about the approach we're doing is we're open to embracing and looking at the wide spectrum of these possible positions. Right? So the answer to your question is a work in progress.
So can you share what you have done up till now?
Not yet, because we're still going through review by external reviewers, but it will be available, inshallah. It will be available.
Jazakallah khair.
Barakallahu feekum.
Assalamu alaikum. I'll just take a few minutes. So first of all, it was amazing to hear about the Fitra model being talking about in public. My teammates who are here know that I keep talking about the Fitra model of education a lot, and in fact, our director, Dr. Misbah, was actually elbowing me the moment you mentioned Fitra. Like, this is your topic. So, alhamdulillah, we're actually working on a concept called organic schooling that I'd love to discuss with you maybe some other time. I had a question, actually, the model that I had been developing, where it differs with the model that you presented. So I love the fact that you split in from 0 to 7 to the age of Tamiz, and then 7 to 14 is till Bulugha. I also differentiated it, the 7 to 14 into 7 to 10 and 10 to 14, because 10 is the age in which the Prophet tells us that you can start putting the child to task and keeping them accountable. So what I tried to understand is, the way I saw it, the age of 14 is Bulugha, and I understood it as starting of adulthood. However, you put adulthood at 21, and you, right, basically 0 to 21 according to you is childhood, and 21 plus is adulthood. Because even in our Sharia text, 14, the age of Bulugha, is the age then when the child is accountable for legally, we talk about the person being, Baligh and Aqil and Muslim for the rules to apply to him. So what was your reasoning, if you could describe it in a very brief way?
I think the best person to answer that question is sitting in the front row later. But just a quick comment on that.
Yeah. I know it's a very deep question. It has to go philosophically.
So the divisions I talked about, these are broad divisions. Like I said, there's 0 to 2, 2 to 5. There's a lot of subdivisions. I just spoke broadly just to give you an example. But in terms of fiqh, I think and I'm not an expert in fiqh, that's why you should ask the ulama about this. But yes, 14 is the age of bulugh, but it's the beginning, not the end, right? Mm-hmm. And so in some fiqh texts, as far as I understand what my discussion was with many of the shuyukh, there's some leeway for teens because
okay, interesting.
The age changes. Like, does everyone reach bulugh 14? No.
No,
right?
12 to 15 or maybe sometimes later on.
The beginning of the process is, let's say, here, but actually the end of the full cognitive capacities that we develop are much later. Right. So if we were to ask a question, when does this vehicle that you have, which starts this small, that becomes this big, right? When does it become, when then all its faculties become fully developed and ready to carry the mission of the ruh in this world? 21.
So how, if I could ask, how did we come up with is it mentioned in the Sharia or is it from philosophy?
No, well, it's, okay, that's why it's a mixture of, a lot of the educational texts draw on the hadith traditions, the aqwal al-sahaba, but also existing practices that are thousands of years old. Some of them are based on Aristotelian psychology, which is embedded in the Islamic tradition. So a synthesis of these have provided a map that's not taken to be sacred.
I understand, yeah, definitely.
But it's a map that we use to navigate.
It's a functional map that
the journey of childhood. That's all it is. That's all it is. And there are difference of opinions. There are different sources that have different classifications. But another thing we have to take into account is today's generation is very different. So the question is, there's everything we talked about. I mean, none of things are set in stone. Even the 714, it's a rough approximation, right? To what extent do our children today even mature? We have man-childs in their 30s who are still children, right? So we have to really think about this question and what's happening developmentally with human beings. And maybe adjust some of our understanding based on it. Because we can't assume that a 14-year-old today or 15-year-old today is the same 15-year-old 200 years ago. Right? Okay, we have to leave it at that, inshallah. We've exceeded the time. Barakallahu feekum.
Jazakallah, thank you very much. We've exhausted the time allocated for the session, and I know it's very deep, and you may want to engage with Dr. Samir, who will be with us for the next 3 days with any questions or queries you may have. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the QR code. If you could just take it down, and we'll take you to a very short Google feedback form. We really appreciate your feedback because it allows us to improve on our services to you. And so if you could just take a few minutes to do that, inshallah. We're going to break for tea in a few minutes. And thank you very much. It's best you complete that right away while it's in your... If someone's having difficulty getting to the Google form, we do have a paper questionnaire to fill out. If you wish to raise your hand, someone will bring a paper copy to you. Raise your hand. There's someone here in front that requires a paper copy. If you're having difficulty accessing the electronic one, there are hard copies floating around. We'll capture that on your behalf. Ladies and gentlemen, what you see on the screen now are the names of the institutions we will be visiting on Thursday. At the end of the conference, on Thursday, we intend taking delegates to spend some time at schools in the Shah Alam and Kuala Lumpur area. In order for us to hire the buses and make the arrangements at the respective schools, we put out a chart at the registration table. These are all the possible schools and institutes you can visit. Sometime today, before lunchtime, please book your name in onto one of the buses going to any of the schools you'd like to visit. It's a limited number of seats on each bus, and because we have males and females traveling in the same bus, there's a demarcation for males and females in the bus, and so we can't fill the bus to its capacity. And so it's going to be on a first-come, first-served basis. As you register or choose, put your name down for a particular school. So that will be done between now and the end of lunch today to allow the team that are coordinating the bus and the visits to the school to do their work, inshallah. I'd like to invite Dr. Samir up to the stage again to receive a certificate of our appreciation for his wonderful presentation, inshallah. Jazakallah, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We break for tea now, but let me tell you, you've got to be back by 10:30. You've got to be back by 10:30 for the next session. Ladies, if you exit the door on my right and turn right, there's a tea station for you. Gentlemen, if you exit out here and make all the way to the left, your tea stations are there. See you at 10:30 promptly, inshallah.